Hi everyone, it's Holly and I'm here with my September wrap-up. I read 14 books this month and that's crazy to me. I have not been reading that much like all year basically. I'm like back on track with my Goodreads challenge, and I'm not gonna lie, I say every year like 100 books is totally doable, and I have always believed that, but there was a moment where I was like, oh, maybe I won't read 100 books, and maybe I still won't, and that's okay if I don't. Please see reading burnout video if you want more information on that. I did read a lot this month. So to start with, I read 2 ebooks. Well, I read 3 ebooks, but you know, 2 by Serena Bowen, Bittersweet and Steadfast, and they're the first 2 books in her True North series, and these take place in Vermont. I gave Bittersweet 4.5 stars and Steadfast 5 stars. I read Steadfast so quickly, I didn't even know what to do with myself, and I just like cannot wait for the 3rd book. I need it right now. They were just really, really good. Bittersweet is about a guy who runs like a dairy and an apple farm, and his like real passion is making cider. And then there's a girl that he hooked up with in college, and then they end up like meeting through her job as well, trying to buy like local farm to table kind of stuff. It was definitely a really cute story. It's Serena Bowen, so of course it's great. I think the thing that I love most about Serena Bowen is that like she makes this beautiful world, and I think sometimes that's overlooked in a contemporary story, but that's really what sells it for me. I think a lot of times that's why people like small town romances, and this actually has a little bit of a small town feel. The hero Griff, his family stole the show, and these books really made me want to go to Vermont. Like, I've never been to Vermont, and I've never particularly had an interest. I live in New York, so I feel like a lot of stuff that's in Vermont is in New York. You know, I live in apple country as well, so it's not something that's foreign to me, but she sold it. And then Steadfast was like a more emotional read, and it deals with addiction, and I personally thought it was done really well, but I have not dealt with addiction, so can't speak on it from a personal perspective. And then I did a reread, which was The Hookup by Kristen Callahan. At this point I was kind of in a weird spot. I didn't know what I wanted. So I was just like, okay, I'll just reread something, because I wanted to read. And I gave it 4 stars again. It's the first book in her Game On series, I think is what it's called. It's a football new adult story. It's a cute story. I like it. I would say it's better than a lot of new adult, but it's not like the most amazing thing in the world. I read A Scot in the Dark by Sarah MacLean, and this is the 2nd book in her Scandal and Scoundrels series. I gave this 4.5 stars, but I honestly do not remember that much about it. Oh, actually, no, I do remember. Alright, so this is about a girl, and she's like a ward to, I don't know if he's a duke. And they've never met. He kind of like inherited her. And because, you know, it's what I'm sure that happened, but it happens a lot in these books. And I will say I'm not a huge fan of like the warden story, is that what you would call it? I don't know, there just tends to be like a weird power dynamic there that makes me uncomfortable. And she finds herself in a pretty scandalous situation, so he has to come like rescue her and all of that. It was actually a very scandalous situation. Like, scandal is an often used conflict, or like, there's a word for this, like inciting action, is that the right term? In a lot of romance, especially historicals. But I feel like they tend to be kind of tame, especially compared to what happened in here. That was a little ballsy. Overall, I liked their story, I liked their relationship. Sarah MacLean kind of addressed some things like consent, and it's not rape, just to be clear, but consent can mean a lot of things. So I think it's important to view that idea in different areas, and slut shaming and stuff like that. I have seen some negative reviews of this, and I don't really get it, but maybe I just really like Sarah MacLean. I don't know. And I am excited for the next book. I've seen some like hesitant comments about the next one, and I agree. I'm a little hesitant on how it's going to happen. I'm not going to go into it, but if you've read them, then you would know why that one could be could be potentially dangerous, but I trust Sarah McLean. I read While It Lasts by Abby Glines, which I gave 3 stars. This is the 3rd book in the Seabreeze series. And this is the one about Cage York and Eva, and Cage is supposed to, like, I feel like everyone talks about Cage, and I think this is the one that's been optioned, because I know Abby Glines used to post about it a lot on her Instagram. And I'm not on Instagram a lot anymore, so I don't know if she still does. I don't know, this was a lot of Abby Glines for me. It's just a little flat. I think Eva had a lot of potential to be a different kind of Abby Glines heroine, and then it didn't happen. I'll continue to read this series because I own it, and even though there's a lot of things in it that frustrate me, in any Abby Glines, really, she grips me enough to make it worth it. Then I read Rookie Move by Serena Bowen, and I gave this 4 stars. This is the first book in a new series for her, and this one is traditionally published, which I didn't know. I wish I had known, because I probably would have tried to buy it from a store instead of buying a $7.99 ebook. I'm really mad about that. I really hate when publishing companies sell ebooks for the same price as the physical book, because there's so much more of a profit margin on an ebook. So why are you selling it for the same price? But I wanted to read it, so I bought it, and then I realized it was traditionally published. I could probably have returned to the ebook and then gone and bought it, but that feels weird to me, so I didn't do it. I just read it. I don't even remember. I gave it 4 stars. This is Leo Trevi's story, and his brother is DJ, the hero in The 15th Minute, the last book in the Ivy Year series. And this is about him reconnecting with his high school girlfriend, Georgia. And they kind of parted ways in difficult circumstances. And he is joining a professional hockey league that's kind of up and coming, and she's the publicist. I thought it was a very cute story. I liked them. They had a ton of chemistry, and I definitely like reunited lovers stories. I think I've talked about that before, so I'm not surprised I enjoyed it. And Serena Bowen did a really good job of laying down like groundwork for especially the next story. I want the next 2 stories so bad, because I'm pretty sure I know who the 3rd one's going to be about, and like, please, I need it, because if it's about those 2 characters, I need to know what the hell is going on. If you have read Rookie Move, then you probably know what I'm talking about. Honor's Night by Rachel Bach, which is the 2nd book in the Paradox trilogy. And I gave this, did I give it 5 stars? Yes, I did. So initially it was really slow going for me. Like, probably like the first 100 pages to a third of the book, I thought it was really slow, and I was like, oh no, what if it's horrible? But then it totally worked for me. I'm still hella confused, but in like the best possible way, I guess. Things I thought I understood from the first book, I don't. Now I'm just like thrown for a loop, but I'm really enjoying it. I liked Debbie even more in this story. She's the main character, and I am very excited to read the 3rd one. I have it from the library as well, but I have not read it yet. For whatever reason, as much as I love these books, I can't binge them. Then I decided to try and use Overdrive, which I've tried to use it once, but I didn't actually read the book I got. And so I tried again, and I got Marry Me at Christmas by Susan Mallory. This is book like 524 in her Fool's Gold series. But I have never read her. I was actually at Walmart when I bought A Scot in the Dark, and I don't like to talk to people. I wear headphones in an effort to not talk to people. But this woman, like, talked to me. So, I mean, I talked back because I'm not rude. But she suggested Susan Mallory, and I know of her. So I was like, okay, I happen to be like looking at my library's Overdrive options, and then what that lady said like clicked in my mind, and I kind of wanted a Christmas story. This happens a lot this time of year. I get in a very Christmas mood. I listen to Christmas music. I watch like Vlogmas videos. I'm very weird. I love Christmas all the time. And I haven't read a ton of Christmas books, so I decided to give this one a try. I gave it 3 stars. I thought it was cute. It's about an actor who buys a house in a small town, and he ends up forming a friendship with a local bridal shop owner, and then their like relationship progresses. It was cute. It wasn't overly schmaltzy, but it reminded me a lot of a Hallmark Christmas movie, which is what I'm looking for, so no complaints there. It was closed-door sex scenes. It was a nice small town. I do think reading this out of order may have caused some confusion for me, but overall I was able to like get enjoyment out of the story. Then I read Animal Magnetism. I also got this from Overdrive by Jill Shalvis, and this is the first book in her Animal Magnetism series. I give it 4 stars. And I really enjoyed this. The heroine was a lot more like assertive than I'm used to, and not necessarily maybe in the way you might think, but she just like has a lot of agency, and she did a lot of actions I'm not used to reading in heroines, and I found that really enjoyable and refreshing. But she was still like a human being, and you know, because women can be different from each other. And the hero is like a buff, big, like military guy, and this like dog like becomes attached to him, and it's like a little frou-frou dog, and I think it's like one of the most adorable things in the world. So I did really enjoy it. I think I like this a little bit more than Lucky Harbor books, but we'll see. Then I read Level Up by, I think her name is Kathy Yardley. I had heard this on the DBSA podcast. I'm kind of listening, it's not called that anymore, but I'm still calling it that. I'm listening to episodes out of order because I've been in a weird podcasting mood too. And so I believe they mentioned this on an earlier episode I haven't listened to yet. But I was listening to one about women whose husbands also read romance. And this was like one of the guy's like intro books, and he was like raving about it. So, and it's free, at least on Kindle, so I got it. I gave it 3 stars. It's kind of more of like a novella. It was a good story. It's about a heroine who's a coder, and she's trying to make her way in the video game industry, which is like a male-dominated field, and it's very aware of that, and it's definitely trying to prove a point, which doesn't bother me. And she's a person of color, which is kind of not a major point, but I think it's still nice. I actually like it almost more when you have like persons of color or any kind of diversity that's just like it exists, because I think that's the most honest representation of diversity, because they're not special. But I also understand the other side of things, but I'm not going to get into diversity right now. I also don't picture a lot of characters the way authors do, so I make them diverse in my head a lot of times. So I think that's also just a function of my upbringing, unfortunately. So I was just exposed to more diversity, but again, story for another time, or conversation for another time, that I'm not even sure I want to wade into. And then the like hero character is a guy that works at the company that she works for, and then she also lives in his home. She like rents a room, and it was a nice story. I think it had a lot of potential. Maybe if it was full length and like had like 10 or 20,000 more words, it could have been more like fully developed. Just some things were like rushed over. There was a lot of potential for really solid female friendships, and they were there but not built enough for me to understand them, and that was a little but it was a nice story. It's definitely nice to read about scientifically minded female main characters, and you know, I felt a little pride and everything. And she talks about consent openly, which I feel like doesn't happen a lot in romances. Now, I hadn't really thought about it until listening to that podcast, because I mean, I really think you should just go listen to it, because it's really interesting. They talk about a male's perspective on romance, where like, would it be good for younger boys, like teenagers, to read these books and to see the way that men act around women, because it condones relationships that, because we've been reading them for 10, 15, 20 years, or because of like the social dynamic. Of course, when I have like an important thing to say, my camera battery dies. Women kind of will let things go as fantasy, but when men look at it, they can see a different perspective. So, I mean, I highly suggest listening to that podcast. I thought it was really interesting, and it kind of does make me look at romance slightly different. Then I read Animal Attraction by Jill Shalvis. I picked this up at my library, and this is the second book in the Animal Magnetism series. And this is about Jade is like running away from a past, and which also wasn't rape. Really glad it wasn't rape. I'm sorry, that may have been a spoiler, but I consider it a not trigger warning spoiler, so it's fine. And she works for Dell, who's the hero in like his veterinary clinic. And again, I'm not a big fan of power dynamic issues, but it was okay here because she's a pretty powerful person. I didn't struggle with it as much in here. I gave this 3 stars. I didn't like it quite as much as the first one. Then I read Up in Flames by Abby Glines, which is one of the Rosemary Beach books. And I don't know if this is the last one or what. I did skip a book coming to this one, just because her ebooks tend to be pricey. And then my library actually happened to just have, I just checked the new releases and they had it, so I picked it up. This is Nan's book. I gave it 4 stars, and actually I personally think that this is the best book that Abby Glines has ever written. I read some reviews that were pretty negative. I think she definitely strayed from the norm here, and I'm very grateful for that. I think she explored a different kind of heroine. I think she explored a different kind of hero. I think she explored a different kind of writing style. I think she addressed some really important issues, and Nan, I would have liked to see a little bit more of her growth, but personally I don't know if I've been like searching for it in previous books, because I've always complained that I don't dislike her because she's a bitch. I dislike her because she has no reason to be that way, as explained by Abby Glines in the previous books. So getting some of that explanation in here was definitely helpful. And then also I've been seeing little bits of what could happen to her in previous books, and I'm pretty sure I said this in one of my written reviews for some book. I think it was Willow's second book, is that I would love to see Nan change, not because of a man, but because of either a healthy relationship with a woman and women, whatever, or with a child. And I think to some extent she changes like through agency of her own, like she doesn't want to be that person anymore, but she's been like crapped on her whole life, that it's really hard for her, and seeing her with like her nephew does really help. I don't know, I really liked it. So to some extent I can understand why people don't like it, but I think this is probably one of the more healthy relationships. And that's the other thing. I know a lot of people think that the relationship in here is unhealthy. I completely disagree. He makes some mistakes, and I think that they're bad, and he shouldn't have done those things. I think it's probably one of the healthiest relationships Abby Glines has ever written as well. And then the last 2 things I read were actually 2 audiobooks. And I've talked about this before. I have never considered myself an audiobook person. I actually still don't. I still feel like if I read an audiobook of a fiction book, I would get distracted. But I listen to podcasts, and I was like, okay, well, a nonfiction audiobook is like a podcast, so I can do that. So I heard a book on the DVSA podcast called Quiet, The Power of Introverts in like an Extrovert World or something. I'm sorry, I cannot remember the author's name. I will write it across the screen for you. And Sarah had mentioned it and said that like she saw a lot of herself in it, and that it helped her like find tools for working in her life. I ended up giving this 4 stars. I actually loved the like narrator voiceover artist. I don't know what you call them. I thought her voice was very calming and peaceful and relaxing. This was a nice combination of like explaining what an introvert is, and like maybe why introverts exist versus extroverts, and how in America extroverts are the ideal and how that can impact work. And that was probably one of the biggest takeaways for me, is both my parents, who are introverts, and my boss have been encouraging me to like be more outgoing, do more, participate more, but those things are incredibly exhausting for me. And I've always identified as an introvert, but I never realized necessarily how much being an introvert in an extrovert world was impacting my life. But now I understand why when I come home at the end of the day, even though my job isn't particularly stressful or hard, in my opinion, I'm exhausted. And it's because of like the social stuff and having to pretend to be an extrovert. She also talked about like parenting an introvert, which I thought was really interesting, and I feel like parents should know that. I think it's so important to not think that your kid is broken, but to think that they're just different. And I will say my parents, they never, like, they wanted me to do things, but they were never like obnoxious about it. And she had some interesting like anecdotes like about Rosa Parks and Eleanor Roosevelt and all of those things, because they're both introverts and how they had power because they're introverts. And then I read a book called Survival of the Sickest, which again I will leave the author's name here. I gave this 3 stars. I thought the first chapter was super good. It was gripping, it was interesting, and because the whole book is kind of about exploring how illness, social problems like biologically with us, like in our DNA or whatever, why they exist and why that could be like advantageous for the race or the individual. Race being human race. Or race, but that's a complicated thing. Part of the reason I wanted to read this is because I remember when I was in like 9th grade watching a documentary on PBS, and they were talking about Spanish flu and how, because if you don't know, I don't remember a ton about it, but it killed the healthy, whereas the flu tends to target and kill like children and the elderly, but the Spanish flu was very damaging to healthy, able-bodied people. And they connected that with people who seemed to have like a resistance to getting HIV infection. And I find that kind of stuff very interesting, like the stuff that may or may not be related, but like how potentially surviving one illness means that there's something in your body that can protect you from something else. So that is kind of the idea of this book, but I think that the author